Just getting the video in front of me. James Roth in the house from Indianapolis. Who else is here? Where are you tuning in from? Okay. There we go. YouTube is up. Dan Miller Gartner has joined. Who else is with us? Beautiful. Shelly Kelly says shalom from Ohio. I'll share this to my personal page. All right, beautiful. Ryan Fagan is in from Minneapolis, and Gabe Goritz Ruiz from Hudson, Wisconsin. Welcome to the show. Ernesta Malpelli Shea from Livermore, California. And Nancy Brandon Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Welcome, welcome. And Micah Angela Andag Ang says hi. All right. All right, you got your thinking cap on? Today's daf is a little bit challenging. Very relevant, very modern, actually. When we think about the issues that are involved here, there's going to be financial issues, people entering into contracts with each other, and let's see if we can figure out exactly what is going on together. So, where are we? We're in the second volume of the Talmud, Tractate Shabbos. Today we're doing Daf Ayin Tet, that's page 79. We're in chapter 8, and we're exploring the commentary on the second Mishnah. The Mishnah is about the minimum measure of certain objects that we would become liable to bring a sin offering if we carried them out on Shabbos unwittingly. So we saw that for a length of rope, it's enough to make a handle for a basket. For a reed of grass, it was to measure a child's foot so that we can have a shoe made for the child. And then we came to the matter of paper. And for paper, we said that the minimum measure is a piece of paper large enough to write a tax receipt. And a tax receipt was actually very small. It was really just two letters, two Greek letters, perhaps the initials of the tax collector. And then the question came up, well, if you have a tax receipt, but you've already shown it to the tax collector, so now it's a meaningless piece of paper, it's insignificant, and so even though it's of the minimum size, because it would be insignificant to the person, he wouldn't be liable for carrying it out on Shabbos according to the sages. But Rabbi Yehuda disputes them and say, well, wait a minute, even though he's already shown it to the tax collector, he might want to keep that receipt because he might have to show it to another tax collector or to the junior tax collector or to the senior tax collector. He wants to be able to say, I am a man who pays his taxes. That's where we were yesterday. Today, we come to the issue of a promissory note, and it's going to be the similar analysis to the tax receipt. The question is, if you carry a promissory note out with you on Shabbos, are you going to be liable for it? Now, if this is going to be larger than the tax receipt, right? So in terms of the size of the piece of paper, you would think that you would be liable. The question is, does the promissory note become insignificant after the debt has been paid? And as we'll see, this dispute is going to become more complex than the tax receipt. Now, the overall thing that I'd like us to remember, what makes this interesting, is that when you're talking about becoming liable to bring a sin offering because you violated Shabbos by carrying something, let's say from the private domain to the public domain, so you weren't mindful enough of observing Shabbos, and that you wouldn't do any work on Shabbos, and the prohibited labor that we're talking about is carrying. You don't want to be carrying on Shabbos in the absence of an Eruv, which makes a sort of legal courtyard out of the whole area within the Eruv. So this is really a matter between you and God. right? It's the first tablet of the Ten Commandments, which generally regulate affairs, relationships between a person and God. The financial instrument is very much regulating the affairs between a person and another person. And now we're going to see that there's an interplay between these two fields. And indeed, we can just say at the outset, we have a teaching from our sages that when we leave this life, right, when we come to the end of our lives and then we find ourselves in the next world, they will ask us, the first question that they will ask us, were you honest in your business affairs, right? And this is specifically in those little negligences, those little things where you took advantage, where nobody was ever going to know. Only God would know. And a righteous person is one who's going to be meticulous in his financial dealings with other people. All right, let's examine the case of one who carries a promissory note out on Shabbos. Is he going to be liable for carrying? If that promissory note is a significant document, if it's meaningful, if it's not just a piece of garbage, then the answer is going to be yes, he's going to be liable. Okay, so the promissory note, generally, the sages say, if you're carrying a promissory note for a debt which has not yet been paid, that would mean that the promissory note is definitely significant. It's worth the money that it represents, the debt that it represents. If you carry that on Shabbos, you're liable to bring a sin offering. But if the debt has already been paid, so the financial arrangement is over, now the promissory note doesn't represent any financial obligation. It doesn't mean anything anymore. And so the sages say it is insignificant and the person is not liable to bring a sin offering if he had that piece of paper in his pocket. Presumably it's not meaningful anymore, and that's why he forgot about it. It just happened to be in his pocket. Rabbi Yehuda says even after the debt has been paid, the document remains significant and the person is liable for carrying it. And we're going to see why Rabbi Yehuda says that. Rav Yosef looks at this dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda, and Rav Yosef says, well, what is between them? What is the difference? What are they arguing about? Why do the rabbis say that for a debt that's already been paid, the promissory note is no longer significant, and Rabbi Yehuda says the promissory note remains significant? Rav Yosef suggests that you have to understand that the rabbis prohibit keeping a promissory note after the debt has been paid. Now here, this gives us a little bit of a peek into the ancient world. Today, we get into a contract with somebody, we get into an obligation. I mean, we sign 5 pages, 10 pages, these long contracts, and they're drawn up in multiple copies, and there's an electronic copy that is maintained in a database here and a database there. In the case of mortgages, right, the bank lends the money to somebody to buy the house, and then the bank turns around and sells that mortgage, you know, to a larger institution who packages the mortgages and sells them as an equity to larger groups of people. Back then, it was much simpler, right? Somebody lent money to someone else. So they made a promissory note for the loan. When the debt was repaid, the rabbis are saying at that moment, the lender must return the promissory note to the borrower, and the borrower should destroy it right then and there so that it can't accidentally fall into somebody else's hands, who will then come along and say, hey, I have a promissory note. You said you were going to pay this money. Here's the note. Obviously, you haven't paid the money because I have the note. The rabbis have said once the debt is paid, the note must be destroyed. If the note was not destroyed, this is evidence that the debt has not been paid. That's what Rav Yosef is saying is at the heart of the dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda. The rabbis say the note must be destroyed. If the rabbis are saying the note must be destroyed, what does that mean about Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda is someone who's saying, no, the note doesn't have to be destroyed. There may be a reason to keep the note. What has to happen, when the debt is paid is what? That the lender returns the promissory note to the debtor. The debtor may have a reason to hold on to the note after the debt has been paid. What must happen is that he gets the note back so that nobody else can come along and say, hey, I have this note, this guy hasn't paid. If he himself is holding the note, okay, if he gets sloppy and drops it somewhere and somebody's going to bring and hold it against him, that he has only himself to blame, so long as the lender returned the note after the debt was paid. Abaye looks at this conflict and says, no, you don't have it quite right. What's really going on here is that all agree that the note may not be kept once it's paid. The case is that the lender brings the note before the court. So now we're in a situation where there's a dispute, right? Somebody lent money, somebody borrowed money. At a certain time later, the lender comes to the court and says, this is the promissory note that I received from the borrower. Why would the lender come to the court with the note? Presumably because he hasn't been paid. At that point, we're going to argue about the issue of a ratification. What is ratification according to our sages in Talmudic times? It was not a universal practice. It existed in some places and not in others. If a lender shows up at the court and he says, this is the note, I haven't been paid. They bring the borrower before the court. The first question they ask the borrower is, did you borrow money and write a note? If he says yes, in jurisdictions where they have ratification, now the lender has to prove that this note is the note that the borrower admits to writing. The borrower might say, yeah, I wrote a note and I paid it off, and then we destroyed the note. That note is not the note that I wrote. So at that point, the lender has to bring the witnesses. When you create the promissory note, witnesses have to sign it. So now to ratify the document, you got to bring the people who signed it and say, yes, that's my signature and I was there when this guy borrowed money and wrote this note. That is the original note. Or if the witnesses are not available, people who recognize and can ratify that that signature belongs to the real witness. If the signatures are ratified, then the burden will shift to the lender. The lender's saying, hey, I already paid, but if this document has now been ratified, that is evidence that he must not have paid because the lender has the note and it's a good note. Rabbi Yehuda says once he admits that he borrowed money and that he wrote a note, the fact that there's a note here in court is enough and ratification is not necessary according to Abaye. So, hold on a second. So Rabbi Yehuda says once the borrower admits that he wrote the note, the burden shifts to him to prove that he already paid because the lender is appearing in court with a note that suggests he didn't. Rava changes it a little more. He says that all agree that once the debtor admits he wrote a note, that it does not need to be ratified. The question here, according to Rava, is one of receipt. Does the borrower have a receipt? Was a receipt written? The rabbis say we don't do receipts. You shouldn't have a receipt. You borrowed money, so you gave a note. You paid back the money, you get back the note. When people write a receipt, it's not as good a system, according to the rabbis, because at that point, the borrower might receive a receipt and the lender might keep the promissory note. So the borrower, okay, he has evidence that he paid, but if he loses that receipt and the lender still has the promissory note, now it can be brought into court and it's evidence that the borrower didn't pay. Much better the system, you borrow, you issue a note. You pay back, you get the note back. Now nobody can bring a note against you. The only problem is, what if you borrow money, you write a note, you make a partial payment? Obviously, you're not going to get the note back because you haven't paid off the note. But you want evidence that you paid part of your debt, so you get a receipt for that. Now we have the issue of receipts. So if we're going to get a receipt for a partial payment, why wouldn't we get a receipt for the whole payment? But you see what the problem is. In a period where there's much fewer documents and much less documentation and no electronic record and no registering these debts with a government authority, etc., we can get to this problem where people, and perhaps what happens is let's say somebody borrowed, right? He borrowed money. Later, he got the money to pay back. He ran into the person that he borrowed from and he said, here's your money. And the guy said, oh, wonderful, thank you for paying me back. I got to get you the promissory note. I'll give it to you tomorrow. That night, the lender dies. Now the heirs come in and look at the papers of the lender. They just find his money. They don't know that part of that money was the debt that was just paid back by the borrower, but they find the promissory note among the holdings of the lender, and they say, here's the note. Clearly he hasn't paid, and they bring him to court, and he doesn't have evidence. That's the difficulty that we're dealing with. That's a very real difficulty, a very real world difficulty that could come up. So the Tana, the rabbi that challenged Rabbi Yehuda says, we write receipts. Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't write receipts for this reason, because we could get into that trouble. According to Rabbi Yehuda, once you pay back the loan, you got to get the note back. You can't leave that note out there where it could be held against you. According to the one who says that we write receipts, so if there is a receipt, then the lender could keep the note, even just to use as scrap paper, because now it's not meaningful. Now we're back to the original question. If you go out on Shabbos and you're carrying a note for a debt that has been paid, are you liable for violating Shabbos? It's an insignificant piece of paper. And so the lender might have kept it just without thinking about it. Now it's in his pocket on Shabbos. It's an insignificant piece of paper. But what Rav is telling us is that would only happen in a jurisdiction where they write receipts, right? And that when a lender pays off his debt, what he can expect to get back is the receipt, that the lender might keep the promissory note. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, don't be in that position. Don't put yourself in that position. That's not a good system. We don't want there to be promissory notes out there for a person who's already paid his debt. So Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't write receipts. The borrower, when he pays off, he should get that promissory note back. So why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda then further advise that the borrower who paid his debt and got the promissory note back, wouldn't it follow that what he should do is destroy it immediately? So now there's no potential of anyone later in the future coming to him and saying, hey, I found this note. This is my note. You owe me money. He'd be protected from that if the note was destroyed. But Rav Ashi comes to say what Rabbi Yehuda was telling us is a borrower might well want to keep a promissory note for a debt that he already paid. Why? Because he wants to be able to say to any future prospective creditors, I am a man who pays his debts. And here is the evidence. I borrowed from Reuven, I paid back Reuven, and here's the promissory note that was returned to me after I paid my debt. Now you, Shimon, here's the note. You can trust that if you lend me money, I will pay it back. I am a man who pays his debts. And that is what's at stake here. And now we see how we went from a question of significance in terms of carrying on Shabbos. Could this document, after the business deal of the loan is over, somebody lent money, somebody paid the money back, the business deal is over, the paper that represents it Is it significant? The rabbis say no. Yehuda says yes. The paper is significant because I can use it to show that I'm a person who pays my debts. And the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. The paper is significant. I think a takeaway from this discussion, from this analysis, is work with a lawyer. If you're gonna enter into an arrangement to borrow money from somebody, I mean, right? What's the old saying? If you lend money to a friend, you're gonna lose the money and the friend. That's sad, because what that's saying is that people are going to enter into an arrangement and they're not going to be able to handle themselves within a business context according to a righteous standard, right? If the two people are going to hold themselves to a righteous standard, they're going to behave like mensches, there's not going to be a problem. But because people are friends and they take advantage, problems can arise. To avoid problems arising, you want to be as transparent as possible. You want to document the deal, and you want to document the stages of the deal. If money was paid, you want a receipt for that. If the loan was paid off completely, you want a receipt for that. And nowadays, we don't represent deals with a single promissory note, one copy of it, so that it's torn up at the end. That's just not gonna happen. So you really want to make sure that you document every stage of it, and you document it in such a way that all agree that the stage that we've reached in our deal has been documented properly. I'm not a lawyer. But I did go to law school, and I passed the bar in New York, and I worked as a lawyer for a couple years at the beginning of my career. Don't hold me to the standard of a lawyer. Don't ask me for legal advice. It won't be worth anything. I haven't practiced law in 30 years. But on this matter, I can tell you, as your friendly accidental Talmudist, as well as a recovering attorney, get it on paper. Behave like a mensch, and get it down on paper, per the advice and intent and meaning of Rabbi Yehuda. One last point from this daf. Now that we're talking about minimum measure of an object, that when you go out on Shabbos carrying it, it's significant enough to make you liable to bring a sin offering. On the issue of hides, right? So animal hides that are going to become leather, or when there's enough processing going on, they can become parchment. We learned that with hides, it depends how processed it is, what the minimum measure is going to be. What we call matzah, not bread, but matzah in terms of animal hides, means the unprocessed hide, like you just flayed it off the animal. Let's say a cow was slaughtered and we're going to eat the steak, and its skin is the hide. So the unprocessed hide, how much of it do we call a significant measure? Enough to wrap a small weight, a shekel weight. Chita means that we have begun to process the hide, moving in the direction of turning it into leather or ultimately parchment. This means that the hide has been salted. And at that point, how much is enough to be liable? Enough to make an amulet out of it. And if it reaches the stage known as diphthera, it means it's been treated, it's been salted, and flour has been spread on it, and some other processes have been done to it. So then now it's something that you could write on it. How much is a significant amount? Enough to write a get, meaning a bill of divorce. A divorce document, I guess, is not such a big document, but it's enough to be a document. So for diphthera, the minimum size is to write a bill of divorce on it. And then we learn that when we're talking about really processing the hide, and so we can turn it into parchment, right? Or dochsostos. What is the difference between parchment and dochsostos? Parchment is what we would use to write the prayers on that go inside our tefillin, right? So if you saw me earlier today, I was reading Hallel and I was wearing my tefillin, the black strap that leads to a box on my arm, and the straps around my head and neck that lead to a box on my forehead. And inside those boxes are parchment scrolls with verses from the Torah. So in terms of parchment, this is now we've moved on. We're not talking about the minimum size for Shabbos obligation, although it is. The minimum size of parchment is enough to write the Shema verse that goes inside the tefillin. That is the minimum size for liability to bring the sin offering if you carry it out on Shabbos. But the discussion also goes to, well, what is the difference between parchment and doxostos? Parchment we use we write the verses inside tefillin. Doxostos is a little bit thicker, and we use it to write the verses that go in a mezuzah, right? A mezuzah is the scroll made out of animal hide on which we write the Shema, and then that's the mezuzah. And what we usually call the mezuzah is the case on the outside that simply protects the mezuzah scroll inside, right? So we write the mezuzah on something called doxostos. It's a little bit thicker. Parchment is the very thinnest type of membrane that we extract from an animal hide, and we use it to write on, and that's what goes in the tefillin. And then the rabbis are unsure, which part of the hide is the parchment and which part is the doxostos. And Rambam says that the parchment is the thinner layer that is closer to the flesh of the animal, and the doxostos is a slightly thicker layer that is toward the outside of the animal, toward the hair that covers the animal's hide. But other commentators disagree and say that the parchment is toward the hair and the doxostos is toward the flesh. But we hold like Rambam, and that parchment on which we write the holy verses that go inside our tefillin are the very thin membrane, the thinnest that there is, and we write on the side of it that is towards the inside, towards the flesh of the animal. And it's this idea that the verses of the Torah, are protected, right? We don't write them on the outside of the hide, we write them on the inside of the hide, which shows that it's a little bit more precious to us. It was closer to the beating heart of the animal. It was more protected from the outside elements. That's what I've got for us today on page 79. With God's help, tomorrow we'll go on to page 80. I'm going to look at questions and comments in the comments in a moment. Tomorrow we'll proceed, I say God willing, to look at minimum measures for ink, for hair, and for lime. And with that, we should be able to wrap up Mishnah number 2 and move into Mishnah number 3 of chapter 8. It's been my pleasure and my honor to teach this passage with you tonight. All right, let's see what we've got here in the comments. Ryan Fagan is with us from Minneapolis. Let's see. I said those people. Debbie Hatch Hamelink is in from North Florida. Checking in. Adam Sikorsky is in from Minneapolis. Beautiful. Lucy Rom Johnson in Minnesota. Johnny Ogletree is in the house. Lindsay from Ohio. Lena Koperin from Michigan. Michelle Guret says, Shalom, God's perfect peace be with you from New Hampshire. Beautiful. David Strauss in the house. Hopefully you're still with us. It's great to see you, David. Ari Lubitz and David Shapiro. John Missikar says, Shalom from Pennsylvania. Owen Meyer says, hi. Somebody's writing in Russian. I can't even read your name to say hello to you. But to the person writing in Russian, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. Bridget Crossland says, love from Dallas. William Norwood says, could you just make a mark on the note? Now, that seems like a good and practical idea. Take the note and write in big letters on it, paid, right? That would be good. I don't know why that didn't come up as a possibility. It certainly makes sense. Though at the beginning of this discussion yesterday, we did talk about a document that had been written and erased. And perhaps they were talking about that when the promissory note was written and then paid off, maybe what they did is rather than cross it out, they erased it. They somehow just scratched all the ink off of that paper. But then they said that it becomes waste paper and that you wouldn't write on it again. I guess it's too damaging in those days to scratch it off. And maybe that was a way of indicating that a note had been paid off. Leona Suthacker says, hello. Zushi Kunin is in the house. Welcome. Janice says, thank you. Nancy says, hi. And Graham Abbott says, shalom from Arizona. Lynn Job says, this was good advice from a recovering lawyer. Ha. Thanks for making this dry daf interesting and understandable. Have a great new month and final Omer days. Be blessed, you and all that is yours. Thank you, Lynn. Okay, my friends, we're wrapping it up. We are in the final days of the Omer. Shavuot, today, right now, it's Rosh Chodesh, so we're celebrating the new month of Sivan. That's why I read the Hallel this morning. If you missed it, it's on the Accidental Talmudist page. And for these first 12 days of the month of Sivan, we don't recite Tachanun in the morning. This is a time of joy. Shavuos begins Thursday night when we celebrate the greatest moment in human history, when God revealed God's self before millions of people, transmitted the Ten Commandments to the Jews who were assembled there, but really to all of humanity for all time. And that is what we're celebrating starting Thursday night. It's a tradition to read the book of Ruth on Shavuos, and so we'll have a public reading with God's help during the day on Thursday. Watch for that. Sending you all a big virtual hug, lots of love from LA, and may you be blessed in all your ways.